Hello again, everybody. This is Mr. Everything, and I am coming back at you with another Wargaming and miniature video. In this video, we are continuing on with our Oathmark boot camp. And in this video, we're going to be talking about how to play the game. Now, this could be more than one video because playing the game is 90% of this tutorial, and I figured I was going to be breaking this tutorial up into about 4 videos. So let's take a look at what the rulebook has to say. The basic game, and that's another thing, we're going to be talking basic game rules, and then when we get to the advanced rules chapter, we'll be talking about advanced rules. But understand that these videos are going to loosely follow the chapter layout in the core rulebook, and we're only doing the core rulebook in the boot camp. After the boot camp, we'll be doing advanced trainings, but those will be coming from the supplemental books. All right, playing the game. We need to talk about the most important thing, and that is the figure. Every figure in Oathmark represents one individual on the battlefield. Every figure has a corresponding stat line. Like a human soldier would have a stat line with letters which represent stats, and then below that will be numbers which represent what that stat's value is. And then there will be things in this special section and their equipment section which will have their own special rules that are tied in with that figure. It would look something like this. Now each stat is explained. A being activation. That's his training or his morale. If you want to activate the figure, or when the figure has to make a morale test. M, or move, that is how far it can move. Fight, or F, that is its skill in hand-to-hand fighting. S is shoot, or his skill or natural talent with missile weapons such as bows and slings. All this is pretty easy so far, right? You got activation, movement, fighting, shooting, and then we go to D, which is defense. It's his natural toughness and or armor. So, you know, it's basically your defense is like your resistance. Okay. And then we have combat dice, or CD. It's the number of dice you roll for this figure in a melee combat, or when making a shooting attack. In this case, the soldier would only be rolling 1 die. Health, H, that is basically their hit points, or how many hits they can, or how many hits it takes to kill a model. And then there's points. Personally, if I was to design the rules, I would have put the points at the end to make it easier to find and calculate, but they wanted to put it right after hits because of some reason, and you build them up with points. And you and your opponent agree on how many points you're going to spend. We'll get into that in a later video. And then their equipment just happens to be, like I said earlier, hand weapon, shield, and light armor. Now the last thing on that stat line is their base size, 25 by 25. That's a 25 millimeter by 25 millimeter, or 1 inch base. On every stat, you want a higher number. A higher number, the better, with one exception: activation. You want your activation to be as low as possible. Units. Units consist of figures with identical stats. So, like you have a unit of skeleton spearmen, or you have a unit of human archers. That's great. You can't put some of these skeletons in that unit and some of these archers in that unit to have mixed units. You can't do that. So a unit is all of the same figure. The unit size, when we talk about unit size, we're talking about how many figures can be in that unit. And that is based on the base size. So larger based units will have different unit size requirements, and then the 1-inch base size will have their unit requirements. So let's talk about those. So a 25 millimeter base can have anywhere from 1 to 20 models. They must be organized into rows of 5 with any leftover figures forming the back rank. So basically, a unit of 20 would be a block of 4 ranks, 5 figures wide. But hypothetically, a unit of 13 would be 2 ranks of 5 with 3 figures in the back. So basically, you're always trying to get 5 across, and then you're trying to get as many, up to 4 ranks deep. Could you do something like that, where you have 4 across, 2 ranks deep? It looks very nice, but that's not the way the game works. You always have to have 5 in the front, and any remainder go in the back. In this case, it's 10, so it's perfect, 2 ranks of 5. All right, so now if you had, like, cavalry is usually on a 25 by 50, right? So you're looking at cavalry having a 25 by 50, which is a 1-inch by 2-inch base. Generally, these can be anywhere from 1 to 10 models, organized into ranks of 5 with the remainder in the back. So it's kind of exactly the same, but it's usually, it's not 20 models, it's only 10. So there's my 5 front. By putting him there, I made an illegal formation. You cannot have 6 in the front, and you cannot have 4 in the front. Remember, it's always 5 with the leftovers in the back rank. Now, large creatures like trolls, they have a 50 millimeter base, which is basically a 2-inch by 2-inch. Just use something like that. We all recognize that guy. But he would have a 2-inch by 2-inch. They would be ranked up to 1 to 3 models. So not a whole lot. 1 to 3. And all figures in the front rank. Now, large monsters like dragons are not mounted on a square, a lot like cavalry. They're mounted on another rectangle, which is 50 wide by 100 deep. So they would equate to the same base as for cavalry. That would be the size of your dragon base, or large monsters, and they tend to fight as one model. Now, mixed. There is a few units, such as like artillery, that contain figures with different base sizes. So you might have the artillery piece on a base, and then you might have the crew on smaller bases. But basically, as a rule of thumb, your humans or your general troops are on 1-inch bases. Cavalry is on 1 by 2, and then ogres and trolls and things like that are on 2 by 2s. Now, every unit must have one model designated as the officer. The officer must be placed in the center of the front rank. So if I was designating this white hooded guy as my officer, I would put him in the center of the front rank. He's always in the center. This guy with the red on his red rags, I'm going to make him my officer, and we're going to put him in the center rank, the center of the front rank. Now remember, you can have units from 1 to 20. So if you imagine yourself having only 4 models, they all would go in the front rank, which is basically the back rank. You would put your officer in either the 2 or 3 spot, so he would be as close to the center as possible. Now, the officer has no special abilities in the basic game, but it is important for determining line of sight and when you move into contact. And he's always the last unit removed from a unit. A lot of players like to have their officers stand out. So they might be holding a banner, or they hold their sword up high. Like this guy just happens to be, giving the 2-finger salute. But yeah, you designate him in some way, either color or weapon they're carrying or something like that. Occasionally you're going to wind up having a unit with only 1 figure left, or you built your army with only 1 figure in it, because you can. It's usually because he's a powerful creature or a spellcaster, but like I said, you might have been reduced to 1 or started as 1, and in those cases they have special rules which we'll elaborate on later. Basically, they're called units of 1. Now, facing. Now, all units have a facing, which is the left and right, the front and back, obviously, right? So if you've got a unit like this, all you do is cross, you put a crisscross between the back and the front, and the back and the front, and those lines that came out this way is your front, and the 2 lines that came out this way would be your side, etc., all the way around. So you'd have the front half, the back half, and then left and right. Remember, you only consider full ranks when determining your front and flanks. So if you've got a couple of extra figures back here, you don't draw the line through that. If you had 4 full ranks, then that front corner and that far back corner would determine your front and flanks. So your front arc can be narrower if you have a deeper ranks. Okay, let's talk about line of sight next. Okay, line of sight is used to determine if you can see an enemy, obviously. A unit must have line of sight to its opponent to shoot it, cast a spell, or even move into contact with it. If the opposing unit is a unit of 1, this is simple to determine. Just draw an imaginary line from any point on the base of the attacking unit's officer to any point on the base of the opposing figure. If the line stays within the attacking unit's front arc and does not pass through any other units or blocking terrain, then the unit has line of sight. Other figures in an officer's unit never block the officer's line of sight. They said that in a weird way, but what they're basically saying is you draw a line from your officer, and any corner of his base is where you can draw that line of sight from, and then as long as your target unit is, and that's any figure like this figure, as long as this figure is still in his front, then they can see each other. If this unit was sideways like this, I can measure this to that other unit, and my line of sight is traveling through these figures, but is this figure in this unit's front? Well, we would determine that by measuring from corner to corner, straight line, and this guy's corner is inside my front. So this guy could technically still see him, even though these guys are in the way. It would be almost impossible for this guy not to see this unit. I would have to be maybe like that, because then my front arc is over here and I can't see them. I can see a downside to having multiple ranks because that narrows your front arc. Okay, so when measuring, and that's when you're measuring to an individual. Now, if I was measuring to another unit, like what I'm doing here, his line of sight, remember the front, would have to cover at least half of these models. So in this case, it would have to cover 5 models. So in this situation, the way it is right now, if I draw a line from this corner to that corner, that line only went through these 4 models. So these guys would not be able to have line of sight on this unit. So I would have to turn a little bit more. Oh yeah, so it traverses at least these 5. It actually traversed all 6 of this end, which is at least half, so they can see them. And you can check line of sight at any time during the game. So you can check your line of sight, you can check your range, anything that comes to do with measurements like that, you can check at any time. Okay, a special note on terrain. Terrain only blocks line of sight if it completely obscures figures in a unit. So if I had that building sitting, whoa, I just knocked that skeleton to high heaven. So if this building was here and I was trying to measure line of sight, even though my front covers the majority of this unit, I can't use that. I would have to measure without going through the building. I still see 6, so I can still see the unit. I don't see a problem with that. But if the building was there, it would obscure because it's covering more than half of the unit. And only units with the special ability large block line of sight from smaller units. Units with the enormous block line of sight from like large and smaller. All right, now we're going to talk about setting up the table. Because terrain and objectives and things like that can become important. Ideally, players agree to place terrain on the table in a mutually appealing manner. Mainly because it looks good. That's really 99% of the game. The reason why you play miniature games usually is because it looks good. Or it could make it tactically interesting, like you might have a building on the other side of the river where there might be a bridge and some trees, and you basically, you and your friends agree on how you're going to set up. But if you cannot agree, or maybe you're in a tournament and there's something on the line, then each player chooses between 1 and 3 pieces of terrain. You each roll a die, and starting with the player that rolls the highest, you take turn placing terrain. It does say reduce the maximum to only 2 pieces if you're on a 4x4 or smaller table. After setting up now, would I consider those 4 different pieces of terrain? No. I would probably say that is 1 piece of terrain. This is 1 piece of terrain, a bridge is 1 piece, a hill is 1 piece. Basically a 12-inch area. I don't see that in the rules, but that's kind of the understanding. Now, if later in the rules it changes what I just said, then we'll get into that. Now, after setting up the terrain, you roll again, and the player who rolls the highest chooses from which table edge they want to deploy your army. So basically what that's saying is, when you're setting up the terrain, don't be so one-sided that you make one side of the table super strong. Because if your opponent wins the toss-up of who gets to choose which side of the table, they're going to obviously choose that side of the table. So what you do is you try to make all four sides of the table equally viable, and it makes the battlefield more fair and balanced. And then starting with that player that chose the table edge can now start deploying his units one unit at a time, and then you alternate. There's a disadvantage to that. The disadvantage is your opponent now gets to see where you're putting your unit down at. And so they can make a decision on their side of the table where they put what unit. So you get the advantage of choosing which side, but there's a trade-off in that you are forced to place your first unit down. Is that a big deal? To some players it is. You take turn placing one unit at a time, and you can place each unit anywhere within 8 inches of your table edge. So basically you're staying within a certain amount of space, which is 8 inches from your table edge, and they're staying within 8 inches of their table edge, and then there's going to be an area of dead space where nobody is set up in the middle. When you set up your units, you have to set them up at least 1 inch away from any other unit. So I couldn't have my archer unit set up there and then have my skeletal spearmen set up there, because now they're within an inch of each other. I would had to have set up at least an inch apart. All right, let's talk about the turn real quick. Each turn, both players roll initiative. When activating your units in turn, and take actions with those units, such as moving, maneuvering, and shooting. Once all units have been activated and taken their actions, the turn ends. So you're going to alternate back and forth, starting with the initiative. Whoever has the initiative, you're going to go back and forth until all units have been activated. Unless the game is over, determined by another situation, if the game is not over, you start a new turn. Okay, let's talk about initiative. At the start of every turn, both players roll 2 dice, remember they're d10s, to determine initiative. Whichever player has the highest result on a single die. This is kind of cool, actually. It's a lot like D&D, where you're rolling with advantage, right? So you roll your 2 dice. My initiative is my highest die, which is 7 in this case, and my opponent rolls their dice, and his highest is 4, so I would have initiative. Okay, but imagine I also rolled a 7, so now we're tied. So at that point we go to the second die, 5 and a 1. So this guy would go first anyway. Okay, you don't see these dice. They're off the screen, but that's okay. You get the idea. I rolled a 7 and a 5, and I rolled a 7 and a 1. If this was like a 3 and a 1, the 7 beats the 3, you stop right there. If I rolled a 3 here, I don't use the 3. I'm going to use the 5. So we stop right there because it beats him. But if he rolls a 5 and I roll a 5, then you go to the second die, and whoever rolls highest with the second die on a tie roll wins. I like that in the fact that it reduces the chance, or I should say it speeds up the game, because it reduces the number of times you have to roll a die. Because imagine you're in a game and you and your opponent roll 1 die each, and you roll tie. Well, what does that mean? You got to pick your die up again and roll again to see who goes first. And this also gives both sides a chance to roll a high number. I like it. The only time it breaks down is if you have two ties, which how often is that? What is that, a 1 in 1,000 chance? Okay, something like that. Now, the player who wins initiative is considered the primary player, and the other player is known as the secondary player. That, whatever. That just means you go first. And if both dice on both are tied, just start over, roll again. Now, there is a special option when you have multiplayer games. Maybe I'm playing undead and I've got a friend who's playing goblins, and then the people across the table are playing dwarves and elves, and they team up against us, and now we've got this 4-player game. Those are the best games. Very little changes, but when you have an alliance, you basically divide into 2 sides, right? And you are considered allied. If you want to randomly roll it, or you guys can pick based on races or however you figure you should be, that's fine. And then one side will become the primary and the other side will become the secondary. And basically, you and your ally, decide who's going to go first, which units are going to go first, who's going to get placed on the table first. That's between you and your ally and has nothing to do with your opponent. Okay, we're going to talk about activation and actions before we go into combat, which is going to be in the next video. But activation. Now, once initiative is determined, the primary player nominates one of their units to make an activation roll. So if the skeletons have initiative, the skeleton player has initiative, he is the primary player, he nominates a skeleton unit to make the activation roll. To do so, you roll 2 dice. If the result of either die is equal to or greater than the unit's activation stat, it activates and immediately takes any allowable action. So it's like rolling with advantage again. So I roll 2 dice and I basically just take the best die. And I have to beat the activation number. That's why you want a low activation, because you want to beat it, right? Or equal or beat it. Now, in this case, I rolled pretty crappy. I rolled a 1 and a 3. And if this unit has an activation of 5, I would not have succeeded. So if the result of both dice are less than the unit's activation stat, the unit is struggling to maintain discipline in the ranks and may take only a simple action, as defined below, and we'll get to that. Once the primary player activates a unit and the unit takes its actions, then the secondary player nominates any of his units and follows the same procedure. And then they go back and forth until everybody's activated. So even if I fail my roll, I still get a simple action, which tells me the unit gets activated. What I like to use is little tokens or little markers next to the units, letting me know, maybe not a big die like that, or maybe a die like that, because we're not rolling 6-sided dice for anything. So maybe I'll put a die beside it, letting me as the player that owns the unit know I've already activated that. If you've only got 5 or 6 units on the table, it's not going to be very hard to remember which ones you've activated. But in big units or big games where you got 10 to 20 units on the table, you might forget. Okay, and importantly, finally, any unit that is engaged in combat during a turn is considered to have already been activated. So if I have a unit of archers over here and these skeletons successfully activate and charge this unit into combat, when it's my turn's over and it goes over to this other player's turn, this unit cannot be activated because it is considered already to have been activated. It does not get the chance to activate on that turn. For this reason, it is often important to seize the initiative and strike first. All right, the activation rule is one of the most important rules in Oathmark. So they have this optional rule. It's called Forward Unto Battle. Because the activation roll is a key component, it represents command and control amongst the confusion of battle. It also makes for tense game moments when you are unsure whether your unit will launch an attack when it is most needed. That said, At the beginning of the game, when both armies are generally just advancing towards one another, activation rolls can slow the game down and provide no real gain in fun or drama. This is especially true if you're playing on an extremely large table. Remember what I said about having to maneuver around until you get to your opponent? In that case, that's not very fun. That's not exciting. Now, if both players agree, you can use this optional rule. On the first turn of the game, you can activate every unit without making an activation roll. If you decide on that and you do that, you use that rule, you can only perform movement and maneuver actions. It cannot attack or move into contact with an enemy. If you want to move into contact with an enemy or shoot or use a special ability in the first turn, then you must make an activation roll as normal. It kind of implies that if you make an activation roll and you fail it, you're still only doing a simple action. You're not getting that free movement from the optional roll because you opted to negate it on that one unit. Okay, so let's talk about actions real quick. We got once activated, a unit can take 2 actions. There are a few exceptions. You can perform your actions in any order. So if you wanted to hypothetically say move and then shoot, you can do that. Or if you wanted to shoot, then maneuver, you can do that. And some units have access to special abilities that only apply to that unit. And we'll talk about those later. Does not have to take its available actions. It may take its available actions. Okay, what are the actions? There's not many. There's move, which once activated, a unit may spend an action to move directly forward up to a distance equal to its move stat in inches. For humans, that would be 6 inches in a straight line. Alternatively, a unit may spend an action to move up to half its move, 3 inches in the case of a human, directly backwards or to either side. And if you decide or choose to use both of your unit's actions to move, the second move action is at half move, rounded down. So you can't take 6 inches and then another 6 inches. You could only do 6 inches and then half again, which is 3 inches. That would be 2. I guess it's because you're getting tired or worn out or you're carrying heavy weight. But that initial surge is your move stat, and then the second one is half move. Yeah. So in the case of a human, it would be 9 inches. Now you could move 6 inches forward and then move to the side, which is halved because it's sideways movement, and then halved again because it is your second move, which would wind up being 1.5 inches. So you could move 6 forward and then 1.5 to the side. Or you could move 3 inches to the side and then 3 inches forward. You are permitted or allowed to move completely through a friendly unit as long as you don't end your move on the unit. You have to be able to completely pass the unit. If you can, then that's perfectly fine. And you can also not penetrate a unit if by moving past the unit that forces you into contact with an enemy. You cannot penetrate and contact on a move. So like if I had 6 inches past, but that extra 3 inches gets me into contact, that's fine. A unit may only move into combat by moving forward and not backwards or to the side. Yeah, so you have to move forward into your opponent. Now, obstructions. There's things like rough ground, obstacles, woods, large ruins. Okay, they're all pretty much the same. Rough ground is double the movement, but you only double while you're in the terrain. So if bog ends and you had to move 4 inches to get out of, okay, if you had to move 4 inches to get out of the bog, you would still have 2 inches left, so you could move 2 more inches. Let me rephrase that. If it takes you 2 inches to get out of the bog, that would have counted as 4 inches, and then you'd have 2 additional inches of movement. So yes, you can prorate your 6 inches of movement from rough ground. Obstacles. Obstacles are things like fences or walls, cliff faces, river fords. Think of it like linear obstacles. So some are impassable, which are too significant to move over in the game, like deep rivers or high cliffs. Now, some obstacles might be crossable, like a wall or just a rise in the ground. Now, if it's like, let's say it's a rock and it's a single thing, when you're moving, your unit is allowed to flow around it. Just count the size of the unit as how many extra inches you had to spend to get around it. If you're trying to climb over something like a fence or a wall, just measure the height of it. If it's 1 inch, then it would count as 2 inches of movement to go over the wall. So you just deduct 2 off of your 6 and just move 4 inches. Now, woods, or maybe a large ruin with a lot of rubble in it or something, and woods are really the most common wargaming terrain. Units can neither draw a line of sight through woods or fire over woods, even if it has the special ability indirect fire. Units may move through woods. They are considered rough ground, so it's double movement. A unit is considered in the woods if any part of the unit's figures are touching the terrain. It is not necessary to try to squeeze your models amongst all the trees. Once the unit is in the woods no longer block line of sight to or from it. Okay, so this is the old Warhammer rule, basically. If I've got a unit outside the trees here and a unit outside the trees here, they cannot see through the woods at each other. But if I have a unit in the woods, that unit can see outside the woods, and the unit from outside can see inside the woods. Now, a unit in the woods is considered to be in light cover when it's a target of shooting, and it receives no bonus in combat. Well, that's because the woods would help both sides, right? Okay. Now, a unit like an artillery piece, or maybe figures mounted on horses or wolves, moving as a unit in the woods, must have to make a morale test. Rules can also be found for large ruins and large buildings and hovels, which we'll talk about at a later time. Okay, movement off the table. Any unit that moves off the table simply by having enough movement to reach the edge. So if I'm trying to escape, and if I can reach the edge, I've considered to have moved off the table. And they are just picked up and removed from the game. Now, all figures in that unit is considered killed when calculating victory points. Okay, another action you can take is something called maneuver. You can change the direction you are facing by using an action to maneuver. This would be either pivot or wheel. You can not take more than one maneuver per activation. So even though you get 2 actions, you can't use both of them on maneuver. A unit may move over other friendly units or obstacles while making a maneuver, provided they don't stop on top of them. If you start or end your maneuver in rough ground, your activation ends immediately, and you cannot perform a maneuver, a pivot or a wheel, that puts you into contact with the enemy. They do not count as a move action, thus a unit may make a full move action and then maneuver, or vice versa. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, the pivot simply takes the unit's officer and turns it to face the desired direction, then reform the unit around it. If you're using a movement tray like that, it makes it easy. A unit of 1 that has not activated during the current turn may pivot to any point, including during other units' activations. This is a special free action, but once it's activated, it can no longer take that free maneuver. Now, to pivot as an example, remember this guy here is the officer. I just have to visually pin him into the table and pivot on him. So if I want this unit to be facing in that direction, I would just turn this unit with him remaining at that exact point that he was on the table, and you can have them facing in any direction as a pivot. There's no limitation to the pivot. Okay. Other than you can't contact the enemy and you can't end in rough terrain, etc., etc. Now the wheel. The wheel is a little bit different. So quite a bit different. During the wheel, a unit changes direction by swinging like a door, with one corner of the unit acting as a hinge. To wheel, nominate one figure in the unit that is on one end or the other of the front rank. So basically you pick this guy or that guy, right? They are the pivot point, as opposed to the officer in the center. The corner of that figure that is not in contact with another model, which is this corner or that corner, becomes the pivot point. You may now move that figure in a way that you choose, so long as the pivot's corner remains in the same location. You then reform the rest of the unit around that figure, so all figures are in the same relative position. Okay. It doesn't give you a movement distance limit, just like a pivot. So if I wanted to pivot around from this unit here, I would just imagine that point not moving, and I would swing my unit around like so until I get to a specific spot that I want to be facing in, and that is a wheel. And you can wheel almost 360. And the final maneuver is called an about face. Now, an about face is basically just taking the unit in its entire position and just turning it around 180 degrees facing in the opposite direction. Still under activation, that was movement and maneuver. Now you also have shoot. A unit armed with missile weapons may spend one action to shoot an enemy. It can only perform one shooting action per activation. So even though you have two actions, you can't shoot and then shoot again. You can move and shoot, you can maneuver and shoot, and you can do it in any order. So I could actually shoot and then maneuver. Okay. Special abilities are done in the special ability section. And then finally, simple actions. Remember that a unit that fails its activation roll may still take one simple action. Now, simple actions include maneuvers and move actions and shooting attacks. If the unit makes a shooting attack as a simple action, it suffers a penalty as though it already moved during the activation. And we'll talk about shooting in the combat section, which will be the very next section, which is going to be in the next video. So thank you for coming out and watching these videos. These tutorials will be ongoing, and what I'm trying to do is break them down into bite-sized chunks so you can learn the rules in its entirety and not just give you some generalities. I'm trying to be very specific. Showing you examples using figures on the table as well as referencing the rule book. Finally, there's going to be, I still have a few more videos to do, like combat, shooting, and melee. And then we also have army building, kingdom building, just to name a few of the videos. Alright, so thank you for coming out and checking out this video, and I'll see you in the next one.